Want to own a business without writing a large check up front? Here are 4 ways to buy a business with little to no money down. Most people think that buying a business requires a ton of cash or you have to be rich to be able to pull it off. But the truth is, many businesses, especially small businesses, can be acquired with little to no money out of pocket. In this video, I'll show you 4 practical ways that you can buy a business for little to nothing out of pocket. So, point number 1, and this is by far probably the most common method you could go about it, seller finance. Since caveman, people have been buying real estate with seller finance. I'm sure you've driven down the street and you see those little signs with Sharpie on them that say, no money down, real estate flipping or something like that. A lot of that's done with seller finance. People will just come to an agreement saying, I'll pay you X amount of dollars per month, and they create their own mortgage and they buy real estate. Well, there's no different with businesses. You could seller finance a business. The very first business I ever bought was a healthcare company, which, by the way, I knew nothing about healthcare and no way how to run a business. And so I'll talk and make different videos in the future about how exactly you can buy a business if you're not very experienced. But I bought it at 23 years old. I had no money. I was fairly, I'm not gonna say poor, but 23 years old, you don't have a ton of money saved up. I bought that business for no money out of pocket, literally zero, because that seller was willing to do 100% seller finance. Now, why would somebody do that, right? Because at the end of the day, they're not getting a whole ton of cash up front. So it takes a very particular type of seller. It takes somebody who either prefers monthly income and maybe they're used to a pension or something, they just prefer to get paid monthly over time. Maybe somebody that wants to defer their tax liabilities over time, because if you sell a business, you're just gonna have to write Uncle Sam a big fat check. Or in many cases, the way I would sell it is ask him, what are you gonna do with all that cash? You're just gonna write Uncle Sam a check, you're gonna put it in your Chase account, and you're gonna earn no interest. Or if you do a fraction of a percent. Why don't I pay you interest? Why don't I pay you 3, 4, 5, 6%? Why don't I pay you interest? Why don't you make money on this? So there are ways that you could structure a deal to where it's advantageous for the seller, and obviously it's advantageous for you. Say for example, you want to buy a local pizza shop, and they're asking for $200,000, but they're expecting that $200,000 up front. Well, just ask them, what are you going to do with that money? You're going to write Uncle Sam a big fat check, and maybe you're only going to be left with 150 grand. Well, what if I pay you, instead of 200, why don't I pay you 300? Just let me pay you over the course of a few years. And what you could do is you could just structure a loan, a 3-year loan, a 36-month loan, and you could amortize it for 10 years. So you're paying it like it's a 10-year loan. And all of a sudden you just bought that business with no money down, because now you're basically, they become the bank. And this happens all the time. And there are ways you could protect the seller could protect themselves, I should say. Their security on that loan is the business itself. So if you ever default and don't pay, they could take the business away from you. So there are ways, there are a million reasons why a seller would do this. And obviously, if you're not asking as a buyer, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You don't ask, you don't get. Nobody's gonna volunteer 100% seller finance. You gotta ask for it. But I've seen with my own eyes, and I've done it myself, buying a business with no money down using 100% seller finance. And even if you don't get 100% seller finance, you can get a big chunk of it. So for example, say you get a bank that's willing to fund 50% of it. Well, get the seller to carry the other 50%. And they'll be subordinate to the bank. And again, that's another way you can do it. You don't need 100% seller finance. It's just, seller finance is such a magic component to a deal where you don't have to worry about the bank, and it allows you to just buy a business much easier, much quicker. Also protects you as a buyer, because if the seller still has some money left on the table, or all of a sudden they're cooperative and they work with you and they help you succeed. Because say somebody sold the business, they gave you the keys and you gave them all their cash up front and they just left and you never heard from them again, you're gonna run into problems. But if they keep money on the table, you can kind of yank their chain, so to speak, and say, hey, I need help, because they're going to want to make sure you're successful so they can get paid back. So if you can get 100% seller finance, don't even watch the rest of this video. That is the slam dunk. That's the best thing you can do. Now, point number 2 is arguably the most common, and it's an LBO, a leveraged buyout. So basically, you're borrowing money, typically from a bank or some type of lender, and you're leveraging the assets or the cash flow that you're acquiring. So instead of me going out and taking out a loan for $1 million in my name and personally guaranteeing it and putting up my house as collateral, for example, to get the loan, and then taking that loan to go buy a business, in my particular case, say I'm going to buy an air conditioning company and they have a fleet of 10 vehicles, and they have a ton of inventory and a ton of assets, and they make $1 million a year in profit. I can go to the bank and say, hey, I need $1 million or $2 million to go buy this business, and why don't you collateralize the assets I'm acquiring? So you're leveraging the assets that you're picking up, and the SBA, if you're in the United States, is a license to steal. They will finance up to 90% of an acquisition, which is debt. That other 10% doesn't necessarily have to come from you. It can come from an investor. You can get a seller to carry a seller note. You can get that 10% in a million different structures. But again, licensed to steal with the SBA up to $5 million at 90%. You could buy a $5 million business for as little as 250 grand. That is not a lot of money. You could buy a $1 million business for 50 grand, and in many cases less, and in many cases for nothing. And so again, leveraged buyouts are probably arguably the most common way. And there's two different buckets. There's asset-based lending and there's cash flow lending. Cash flow lending will be your most common because typically banks are going to want to look to see the cash flow of the assets or the business that you're acquiring to pay back the loan. But there are lenders that are asset-based lenders that are just going to look at the actual dollar amount of the assets that you're acquiring, and they might advance you, say, 75% of that. And so there's different lenders for different applications, but LBOs, again, super common method. A third way that you could buy a business, something that I've done as well, but again, not very common, you could assume debt or assume liabilities of a seller, and you basically step into their shoes. Now, this happens at all scales. Whether you're a $2 million small business, or I just read the news a couple days ago, Elon Musk just sold X, his formerly Twitter, to XAI, his AI company. And the way that structure was done was a $30 billion deal where XAI assumed like $10 or $11 billion worth of debt and issued stock for the rest of it. That's basically seller finance. That's no money down. So if you could do a $30 billion deal with no money out of pocket because they're assuming debt and issuing some stock, there's no reason you can't do that for a $3 million business. I've bought businesses before where basically the seller was burnt out, didn't really know how to run the business very well, and just was struggling. I'll take on your obligations. Let me just sign this paper. I'll take on your burden. I'll take on your responsibility, and I'll run the business for you. And you can take this chain off you, this albatross that's around your neck. You're free. People will do that all day long. Now, typically, you see this more common in situations where you might have a business where it's distressed, or maybe they need to restructure, or you have a seller that just really can't continue anymore and he needs to be able to just get out of his business as quick as possible. I don't necessarily recommend you buy a distressed business, but in certain application circumstances, it might make sense. So keep that in mind. You could assume debt, you could take on liabilities, you could basically take the obligations from the seller and put them on yourself, and in return, you take their business. Point number 4, if you're buying a business that has a huge real estate component, consider a sale leaseback. So what a sale leaseback is, you're under contract to buy a business. Part of that contract comes with a ton of real estate. Well, you don't necessarily want the real estate, or more importantly, you know somebody that does want the real estate. So I read a story recently, this is how I discovered it. A guy bought a car dealership. He got under contract to buy the business. He also got under contract to buy the real estate. And you basically do a simultaneous close where you buy the business and the real estate and then immediately sell the real estate to a real estate investor, and the proceeds that you get from selling the real estate go to pay for the business. So in this particular case, the guy got under contract to buy the business and the real estate, immediately flipped the contract on the real estate to a real estate investor, sold the real estate for $11 million, and then used that money to buy the business. So in effect, he paid nothing for the business, because remember, what you're doing is you're selling the real estate and then leasing it back from the real estate investor. The real estate investor wants the real estate because, well, he's a real estate investor. He doesn't want the business. You just want the business. So you're basically just getting a good deal under contract, flipping the real estate to another party. They're buying the real estate off of you. You're renting it back from them. And in many cases, you could actually make a decent amount of money flipping that real estate that'll cover the price of the business. So again, a little complex. Read into it if you're a bit confused. It doesn't work in all applications. You need a situation where you have a big real estate component to a deal, real estate that's valuable, and valuable enough to the point where you know a real estate investor that you can flip that real estate to. And if you structure the deal right, in many cases, it'll pay for the business. These are just 4 very quick, common ways that you could structure a business with no money down. I'm sure there's 40 other ways you could do it. I just figured for small businesses, these 4 are very common methods that I see routinely. If you are serious about buying a business, if you do have an idea that you have, if maybe you have a deal that you're working on and you want to run it by me, I am accessible. My contact information is in the video description. Feel free to reach out. I will respond. I will have a conversation with you. And if there's anything I could help with, more than happy to do that. If you don't want to watch videos that are similar to this, please click here to watch more. I'll see you in the next one.